Welcome to the Literature Lounge, where writers and authors share their stories behind their stories. Hi, in today's episode, we have with us Sandeep Hasurkar. He's an investment banker, financier, and policy advisor in a 3-decade-long career. With leading institutions in India, he's also been an active participant in India's financial and infrastructure sector reforms, during which period he's closely tracked China's policy and economy. So a lot of people are going to really learn a lot today. Author of the acclaimed book Dance of the Elephant, Walk of the Dragon, How India and China Are Reshaping the World in Different Ways, Sandeep is also a columnist, a speaker at seminars, and on the board of several renewable energy companies. Whenever he can, Sandeep escapes the financial jungle and goes exploring the real forests and national parks. I have to know more about this. So welcome, Sandeep, in today's episode.
Thank you, Mohua. It's very wonderful and very kind of you to invite me.
Thank you for taking out the time. So let's just talk about your career. Your career spans investment banking, renewable energy ventures, and now you're also an author. What inspired all these transitions, and how has it shaped, your perspective to life? I mean, this is like multifaceted. So I was stumbling as I was doing the introduction. You have to tell me more.
So Mohua, as I was mentioning, I grew up in Delhi, and I started off my career with ICICI. ICICI had an investment bank at that particular point of time, which was a joint venture with JP Morgan. The economy was just opening up. So as a young investment banker, we got a lot of opportunities to work with the government, advise the government on policy in financial sector reforms, infrastructure, power sector. And so after working with ICICI Securities and the ICICI Group, I then moved on to another similar firm in the infrastructure sector, which was IL&FS. So there also I continued with that passion of policy making, and at a certain point I felt saying that policy is only one part of it. One really needs to get a sense of how it works out on the ground. So I got into projects in terms of conceptualizing them, implementing them, stuff like that. So over 30 years, I kind of, my journey kind of paralleled that of the reforms and participated in it, did my share of whatever I could in the entire journey. And a large part of this was, China was also opening up. China had in fact opened up a little earlier in 1978. So when we started our reforms in 1991, we did try to keep an eye on what they were doing. So that's basically the genesis of where the roots of this book lie.
Absolutely overwhelmed I am just to hear all of this. So I just hope I ask you all the intelligent questions today. So let's hear about any challenges. Did you ever face any challenges, as a creative professional? And what kind of hurdles did you encounter and how did you overcome them?
The journey of reforms was a difficult one. There was no roadmap. India had been a socialist economy for most of its journey since 1947. So there were ideas and there were, policy papers. Some roadmaps were there, and they were very good also in part. But as I mentioned in the book, unfortunately, India's reforms began at a time when India's political economy was at its weakest, perhaps. Since 1991, India was in a coalition era for government. The political will, the political clarity, the political capital required for inevitably difficult reforms, because what had happened was that over the journey since 1947, there was a lot of structure that had built up, with vested interests and an ossification of the framework. To break those down required significant political capital and political will, which in some senses was lacking because of power coalition government. So, in fact, I had written another book prior to this one, which was on the collapse of IL&FS, which was the infrastructure pioneer and which ended up collapsing. But so that's quite a bit about the ills or the shortfalls, or where perhaps in some ways we went wrong on that journey. So that's broadly the genesis of the book. I thought so while doing policy and doing projects. We did, keep an eye on China, but somewhere I felt we hadn't got all the answers, why their trajectory ended up being different and why ours was different as well. And In public discourse, it often happens that we discuss, oh, China is an authoritarian state and we're a democracy, and that's probably why, China, is able to do what it does. So I thought that probably was a subject which required some further research. So, in fact, I'd enrolled for my PhD at IIT Bombay, where I thought I'd take this up as a thesis. But then on reflection, I said, saying that, perhaps it makes more sense to write a book because it will perhaps reach more people and, inform public debate, which, so something good might actually come out of the entire exercise.
So can you just start by giving us a brief overview, of Dance of the Elephant, Walk of the Dragon, and what is the central theme that you explore in the book?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, Mohua, my career has basically been in finance slash the economy, and that's where I started the book. Of ground I had already covered during my career, and but as I got deeper and investigated it further, I found saying that perhaps all the answers did not lie in the domain of finance and economics. There was a lot of history, culture, philosophy, sociology, which underlay a lot of what happened. For example, there were the special economic zones which China, the SEZs, which started in 78 and which were a great success, which was the first economic success, in fact, which China had after Deng Xiaoping came to power. In some senses, India also, we did try to, have our SEZs. But very few people know that the roots of the SEZ actually lie were essentially extraterritorial ports in China, which arose from the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars in China, where China was forced to cede certain ports and their hinterland to colonial powers, where a light manufacturing industrial base already, was developed. And interestingly, Chinese law did not apply in these extraterritorial ports. So this happened in what was the Chinese called the Century of Humiliation, where they had to cede these, the sovereignty over these ports. But it ended up developing a manufacturing base, and the spread of a diaspora in East Asia, which lay dormant for many years till it again reawakened in 1978 when the SEZs suddenly took off. So there are these, historical aspects, cultural aspects, certain nuances which, perhaps better explain some part of the, the economic story of both the countries.
What's the symbolism of the Dance of the Elephant and Walk of the Dragon?
So that's actually at a much deeper philosophical level. There have been many comparisons where India and China were roughly about the same in 1991 in terms of GDP, per capita. Today, China's economy is 5 times larger than India's.
Yeah,
there's no denying the success that China has achieved.
Truly,
but there are underlying questions which are increasingly being posed about the Chinese model. And in fact, one of the reasons why that book also I felt needed to be written to spark public debate is because, given the challenges that Western democracies have faced in, let's say, the last 5-6 years, the market economies, the Western democracies, China has been aggressively marketing its what it calls the Chinese model in developing countries and in the global south. And I felt this needed to be, fully investigated and fully researched, saying that, the fragility in some senses of the China model, the model which in some way circumscribes individual rights of people, needed to be brought out into the public domain, for a more thorough discussion. Perhaps whether an alternate model could be offered to the global south, which was, perhaps more inclusive, more cooperative, less dominant. So that was one of the other issues in terms of. So which is why, India is now in a sweet spot in terms of being on an upswing. It's a bright spot in the global economy. China is now facing issues after nearly about 3.5 decades of breakneck growth. Yeah, that's the basic idea, saying that perhaps it's more India's time, and now India needs to on the upswing. China will perhaps have to spend a decade or two consolidating and sorting out its issues. So that's the idea behind the dance.
Yeah, you also touch upon the dangers of disproportionate growth, right? So, just for our listeners, can you just elaborate a little more on these dangers and how do they impact both the nations? When we talk about China, you're talking about this growth that has, like, it seems stupendous how quickly they've grown. And, for a country like ours, when we were together, almost facing the same sort of situations, and they have gone so far ahead. So just explain to my listeners, to all our listeners here, what do you mean by disproportionate growth and how it can impact us?
When I started researching the book, we have a tendency to see economics only through the lens of finance, in terms of the numbers of GDP, in terms of GDP per capita, or for that matter, even we've expanded now where we look at social sector indicators. We have Millennium Development Goals, etc. So it still ends up in a lot of ways as a narrow view. The prism gets limited only to an economic development. But increasingly, as we have realized that the economics is only one part of the story, there are other aspects to it in terms of the quality of life of our citizens, depletion of natural resources, the equity of development. So there are a lot of issues that surround what we call development. I think that's a framework which is now, I think, increasingly recognized.
So you've explored both the positive forces, the yang, and the cost, the yin, right, of growth in India and China. Could you just share some specific examples of how these forces play out in each country? Because each country will be different, right? So how do these come together and how do they play out?
China's growth essentially rests primarily on three pillars. One was of course, the special economic zone, which gave it its first impetus, and favorable geopolitical situations in terms of the World Trade Organization rules, in terms of which globalized trade, etc. And the story continued till about 2007, 2008. In 2007, 2008, the great financial crisis happened, where there was a sudden crash of the markets, and demand slackened. And since the entire Chinese economy was based primarily on manufacturing exports, it had to find other engines of growth. So they turned to land and the building of infrastructure. So land in China, China in fact, so the roots actually of the difference between China and India actually lie in the realm of land and leadership. Land in China was essentially either owned or controlled by the state. I mean, so in the rural areas, it's owned by the collective. In the city areas, it's owned by the government. The monetization of this land through urbanization and the sale of these apartments and residences to an increasing urban Chinese middle class constitutes one of the greatest monetizations of history, where so for example, today the Chinese housing market is one of the most important sectors of the world economy. It's about 3 times the size of the US economy, and it runs into trillions of dollars. So what happened is that with this trillions of dollars of monetization, which effectively transferred the surplus from the savings of the Chinese households to the government, enabled huge firepower to spend in terms of building infrastructure, which sparked off this huge construction boom in China. And that is essentially what is, to a large extent, this really took off in 2008. So from 2008 to say about 2020 or 22, about 10, 12, 14 years, this is what has propelled Chinese economy in a big way. Of course, the other thing is that China, of course, also implemented agricultural reforms, which we have tried, but then for multiple reasons, we have not been able to do that in terms of both agricultural land, agricultural produce, prices of food grains, etc. It's a very complex story in India, which has its own political implications, etc. China had great disasters in that, of course, not to forget that, there was a great leap forward in the 1960s, which caused a famine, etc. So those are some of the drivers of growth happened with China. But correspondingly, there has been huge amount of degradation of the environment in China. And for China, unfortunately, it has always historically had an environmental challenge, which has been worsened on account of an untrammeled or singular focus on economic growth to the exclusion of everything else. There has also been a big issue with regard to it faces a severe demographic challenge because China implemented a single child policy about as soon as Deng came back. So this was around, I think about 1980, 1982, they implemented the single child policy. And what that has done is that it has had severe impacts not only on demographics but also on the social fabric of China. Because you are now having the single child households where the child is responsible for two sets of parents, four sets of grandparents, and with those kind of responsibilities, they're having fewer children, and their fertility rate is really dropping. China, in a lot of ways, and as you're aware, you need a growing population, or at least a stable population, to be enough working population to fund those who are non-working or in retirement. And this ratio is rapidly deteriorating in China. It is staring at a severe crisis. So it in a lot of ways highlights, saying that while we have a tendency to highlight the dramatic successes of a particular policy, we tend to overlook the other the yin factors, which are kind of the flip side of the coin, which are equally dangerous to an economic future, or to a nation's future for that matter. So the entire thing has to be seen in the context of both the positive and the negative in terms of how it has moved and how it will move forward. So singular focus, I think perhaps the one big lesson out of the entire business and takeaway is that just focusing on one thing to the neglect of the rest does not make for a wise policy. And I think that's something which we need to take to the developing countries and the global south in terms of offering a more inclusive, reasoned, stabilized model of democratic growth. That's broadly what the book concludes.
So let's just talk a little bit about leadership, right? So what would be, so basically we all know that leaders and their policies changes the destiny of any nation. And so any specific example that you would like to share about, India and China, and what do you think are the leadership qualities that can be even discussed right now on this podcast?
So it's actually, in fact, in a lot of ways, it's in the span of history. Usually, the position of leaders changing the destiny of nations is mostly reserved for the founders of nations. So it would be Mahatma Gandhi, George Washington, Mao Zedong, people who have founded the nation and given it its structure and its in some senses its modern character. It's comparatively rarer to find people, say, mid-course of a nation's journey, who have had an equally dramatic impact. One of the factors which did come up in the research, to my mind, was that China has had, good or bad, and there has been a fair bit of bad also, has had only 5 paramount leaders, ever since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So that has, again, for good or for bad, given it a singular unidirectional impetus. And like I said earlier, an exclusive focus, if it works, it's a super success. But if it doesn't work, it's a disaster. Under Mao Zedong, it was a disaster. There was a huge mobilization program called the Great Leap Forward, which was undertaken by them, which resulted in extreme distress, crop failure, devastation. That was a challenge. And after Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, one of the reasons why he was able to undertake reforms was because he was also one of the founders of China. I mean, he was one of the original, what they call the eight immortals of Chinese Revolution. So his moral stature and his political stature was such where he did not need to exercise power through formal mechanisms. So in a lot of ways, it's like, which the book also mentions, saying that if Sardar Patel, for example, had lived longer, would he have been able to be more effective in terms of, say, undertaking the land reforms that India had started, or for that matter, if Indira Gandhi, post her defeat, had come back in 1980 and had, continued in government for longer, would those reforms which are undertaken in 1991 have been undertaken sooner? And perhaps, more of grassroots reforms, which requires political capital and will, rather than, the low-hanging fruit of gazette notifications and delicensing, etc., which are essentially through, changing gazette circulars and stuff like that. So leadership is very important, and leadership, particularly in a democracy which is not as subject to the arithmetic of coalition, which ends up fairly often as the lowest common denominator of, vested interests, is important to give direction to the country. And India has been fairly lucky in the sense the last 10 years have been good. The geopolitical environment has been good. So we are on a fairly good track, and a fairly good spot to now capitalize on what perhaps could have been started much earlier, but better late than never. Now that we have this opportunity, we should not, let go of this opportunity. So that's broadly, the impact.
Let's just talk a little bit about the environment. Both the countries have got this rapid growth, and obviously there are steps that India and China are taking to address these challenges. I mean, I think for the first time, everybody's waking up to environment issues. For the kind of rising temperature in India right now, we were just talking about before we began. So, how can they balance progress and sustainability? I mean, it's such a double-edged sword, and both the countries are looking at growth, right? And so what are the steps that one can take?
So, in a lot of ways, there's always a bright side, or there's always a silver lining. In India's case, since our upward trajectory essentially begins now, we are also at the cusp of, a huge technological revolution, which is multiple times of any of the industrial revolutions that have gone before. Because what has been happening is that each wave has been exponential to the earlier one. And this particular one, which is now beginning to rise, will see technology transform not only industries, but it will transform the way of life. I mean, perhaps more than even the steam engine did when it was first invented. Because in a lot of ways, India does not have the baggage or the legacy systems of previous of history. It's in a better position to capitalize on these. A small example, UPI. Europe, for example, has not been able to achieve those kind of levels in UPI, nor has the USA. India basically built a structure de novo and was able to evangelize it and get it adopted. So similar, opportunities lie in the field of education, in health, in last mile delivery of services. So it's in a lot of ways getting a relatively more of a blank canvas on which modern technology can be leveraged to paint a more sustainable future. For example, DBT, the Jam Trinity, the Jandan Aadhaar mobile and direct benefit transfers that they've this thing. So for a very long period of time, we've struggled with how do we prevent these leakages. The policies are very good. The money goes from Delhi or from the state capital, but somewhere the middlemen eat it up, and it just doesn't reach the last man in the last line. It's been a big struggle for everybody who's lived through those times. Now with technology, you can be sure saying that he's getting it. There is monitoring. The drones will help you monitor the land. I mean, will update the land records. The photos will be uploaded on the internet, whether the house was built or the tap has reached. So all of these enable act as a multiplier impact in terms of the development that will take place now. So in a lot of ways, it's an opportunity. And on the environment also, for example, because the new economy will be largely environment friendly to the maximum extent that it can. It won't happen overnight, of course, because India and China, in fact, are the two largest populations on Earth, and
Yeah.
no government can put a stop to economic development. Say I will only do sustainability. So a balance has to be struck. But in a lot of ways, both the governments, of course, are conscious, but India is making a particular effort that the development is sustainable. In China, again, it's all eggs in one basket. So they're now, of course, the largest solar producer, I mean, the manufacturer in the world, panel manufacturer in the world. They're the largest electric vehicle manufacturer in the world. But a lot of that capacity is predicated on on export to the rest of the world. And increasingly, what you're finding is that countries are finding that these new industries are becoming strategic industries. I will need to so people will need to protect these industries domestically. Otherwise, they will become dependent on external nations. So India is striking a balance in terms of the environment and the growth that it undertakes, perhaps more than China has historically done, or for that matter, even at what it is doing at present. So yeah, I mean, so growth in future will definitely have to not only look at economics, but it'll also have to look at the environment as well.
For a person who wears multiple hats, like, you are into finance, you are into public policy, and as an author, how do you maintain the balance, and which one of these keeps you inspired?
Well, actually, they are all related. I mean, so even as an investment banker, one dealt with ideas. One was, in terms of so that's basically been a driving force in the sense innovative ideas, new ideas. How can things be done differently? Policy was also about how can things be done differently, and a lot of writing. I mean, except that it would be notes written or for the consumption of governments or for consumption of institutions. And so the step further to the author was just taking it, to a wider audience.
Amazing, Sandeep. So, you know what? We want a quick fire round of questions because I think all our listeners would really want to know how is it that you wear all those hats. I think I need to put a binocular and come to your house and check what is it that you eat in the mornings and what do you read before sleeping. So, are you a morning person or a night person?
I'm a night person.
Which is your favorite travel destination? Let's just talk a little lighter stuff.
Yeah, favorite travel destination is probably Kanha. I mean, I love nature, so I whenever I get an opportunity, I'm like up and out of out of the financial jungle and into the real jungle.
Lovely. And if you were to have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be?
Yeah, that's a tough one. But I probably would like to have. I don't know. I mean, I doubt whether he would, have dinner. But a conversation with the Buddha would be nice. You know.
You would have dinner for all you know.
Yeah, but I mean, very
Yes.
very frugal one. I mean, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One piece of advice for aspiring writers and creators.
Being fearless with the ideas. If you have a logic and if you are able to put it out there, one should, rather than being scared of or intimidated by various conversations or various narratives out there. If you believe that it's worth telling, it's worthwhile. I mean, if it has its integrity and its logic, it would often find resonance somewhere. So
Yes,
that
for sure. I completely agree with you on that. So if you have a story, please write that down. And if you have something to do, a dream to fulfill, please pursue that. And this was Sandeep Hasurkar today for us. Thank you so much for being on our episode. And the book that he's written, once again, it has an absolutely very, very interesting name: Dance of the Elephant, Walk of the Dragon, How India and China are reshaping the world in different ways. Thank you, Sandeep, for being on today's episode.
Thank you so much, man. It's wonderful.
Thank
Thank you.
you.